So I thought start reading the next chapter of that. Well, actually, so it's the same chapter, the next part of the chapter of Harry Potter. Yeah, so we left it at this bit, and I'll carry on. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon. And when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted, as the tiny little old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realised that that man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir. For nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had never been hugged by a complete stranger before. He also thought that he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat that he had spotted this morning. It was now sitting on the garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo, said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behaviour, Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter, and how Dudley had learnt a new word, shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normal. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere reported that nation's owls had been behaving very unusually today. Although now owls usually hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newsreader allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious. And now to Jim McGuffin with the weather. "Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim?" "Well, Ted," said the weatherman, "I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain I had promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight." Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. "Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you?" As he expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. "No," she said sharply. "Why?" "Funny stuff on the news," Mr. Dursley mumbled. "Owls, shooting stars, and there are a lot of funny-looking people in town today." So, snapped Mrs. Dursley, well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her lot. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he had heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, "There's son. He'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. "What's his name again? Howard, isn't it?" "Harry. A nasty common name, if you ask me." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking. "Yes, I quite agree." He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him or Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I've had to record this 3 times because my phone kept dying. So I think that'll be it for now. But then tomorrow I'll read the next part and I'll upload that then. So for now, I'll leave it there. See you soon. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed in the next street, nor when owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner. The cat had been watching. A man appeared on the corner. The cat had been watching. He appeared so suddenly and silently, you'd have thought he'd just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen in Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver hair on his head, silver hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak, which swept around the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light and bright and sparkling, behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realise that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots were unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak looking for something, but he did seem to realise he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He found what he was looking for in his inside pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked that putter outer, until only lights left in the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of a cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the putter outer back into his cloak and set off down the street towards number 4. Okay, so I thought I'd do a little bit more because it was quite a short video. But I am on about 3% battery now, and my charge is downstairs. So I will leave it there, but I promise tomorrow I'll upload